Today's presentation will be given by my friend Charles Sanft, Associate Professor and Associate Head of the Department of History at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. He is the author of Communication and Cooperation in Early Imperial China, SUNY 2014, and Literate Community in Early Imperial China, SUNY 2019. And, well, he says numerous articles and book chapters, but it's actually many more than that, okay? He's probably the most prolific person in the China field, early China field, along with Michael Nyland here. So this is a formidable person, okay? And today he will be speaking, The Emperor Has No Voice, Imperial Utterance in Excavated Documents. So please join me in welcoming my friend. Thank you.
Thanks, thanks, Professor Brown. I'm not formidable, for the record. I just want to disavow that. I will, however, argue that it is a really good time to study Chinese history. So if you aren't studying Chinese history, now is the time for you to quick change. Yes, that includes you. It's a good time because the whole thing is changing, right? The whole world of Chinese history is being shifted by things that look like this. This is a particularly well-preserved example of a set of wooden stripped documents from the Northwest. And I'm going to today talk a little bit about how we can think about these documents and how they can and should change how we think about Chinese history. And I will complain only in passing that they have not yet changed our study of Chinese history enough. To do this, I want to borrow a couple of words, and because I'm borrowing these words, I want to be really clear about what I mean. I want to talk about a historical corpus, okay? And in this definition of corpus that I'm using, I am drawing on corpus linguistics. And they give us a definition of a corpus that is a set of texts. And in the traditional conception of Chinese history, we can think of history as a set of texts. A big set of texts, a set of texts that would take you a very long time to read, but a set of texts nonetheless. This set of texts in the traditional conception has defined boundaries, right? We can say what is part of this set, what is part of this corpus, and we can say what's not part of this corpus. And we can say that this corpus, this set of texts, depicts its subject. So to sum this up, what I mean is that in traditional terms, studying history in China meant studying a defined group of texts. Everything that you could know about the past is in that group of texts, which is to say everything worth knowing. And everything outside of that set of texts is unknowable and therefore not worth knowing. And this was the traditional understanding of history. And we had it this way for a long time. The history of China and history of historiography in China goes back 2,000 years, unbroken, and we all feel a lot of respect for that. And then out comes this something that we can imagine looking like this. Now this is sequential. This is a particular collectania. We can imagine this as our corpus, as our set of texts. It's neat. It's orderly. Everything is in its certain place. If only you could remember every single thing that was in here, and there are about 2 people per generation that in fact could, you would be the best historian. You would know everything that you could know about history. You would be the history master. And then come archaeologists. Archaeologists with their shovels and their dirty shoes, and they dig things up out of the ground. Things that are not part of this corpus and yet are part of certainly the past in China. Things that look a lot like that. And what I would suggest to you is that archaeologists, by doing this, did something to the corpus that not everyone has recognized. In fact, I would say most people have not yet recognized. Because they changed our definition, right? We still have a corpus. We still have a set of history. People still think about the history in terms of this corpus. Oh, I lost it. There we go. Okay. But what we don't have anymore are these defined boundaries. We still have a set of texts, right? History is about text. It's about studying text. That's definitional. If you're not studying texts at core, you're not doing history. This set of text still defines and depicts its subject, but the boundaries are dissolved because we don't know what's going to be dug up next. We simply don't know. And we can look at something like the study of the Qin Dynasty, right? This 3rd century BCE, first unifying dynasty of China, that had a particular picture that emerged out of the original corpus that was completely dissolved by the work of archaeologists, even though not everyone has noticed. And in fact, you'll see the same sorts of things said that were always said. Now we know they're not true. Before, they were just merely suspicious, okay? And we don't know what's coming next. Now, part of this original situation was that because we had defined boundaries around our corpus, we could engage in particular sorts of reasoning. We could deduce. We could bring various pieces together. We could assume that everything created a single whole, right? And by bringing those pieces together, we can make deductions about the whole, and we can make deductions about what's not part of the whole. And what happened when the boundaries dissolved, even though not everybody knew that, is that those deductions, as the corpus is undefined. We begin to need new ways of thinking about it. We need to accept the fact that there's no longer a single whole. We have various perspectives. And of course, you can always say there are various perspectives, right? Every author has his or her own perspective. Yeah. But when you're all part of the big single corpus, it all fits together. And all of a sudden, I suggest, have a situation in which the pieces maybe just don't quite fit together anymore. And they're a lot more interesting because of that. I'm going to look at one of these such places, a place called Jianshui Jingguan in the northwest of China. This is in Gansu province. It is a Han Dynasty post. It was part of the border defense system. It was part of the postal system. It was part of the system of governance that covered the entire of the Han realm. Nowadays, it looks like that. Actually, it's not far removed from what it probably looked like during the Han Dynasty because it's out in a very dry environment indeed. Because of the dryness of the environment, when you bury something there, it hangs around, especially if that something is a piece of wood, and luckily, if that something is a piece of wood with some writing on it. So what people did in those days, right, they were in these posts out on the edge of nowhere, but they were part of a military bureaucracy, connected directly and by frequent contact to the center, and they made records of everything, all sorts of everything, right? How many chickens did we eat this week? 3 chickens, okay, mark that down. When you're done with this, whatever it is that you happen to be doing with it, what do you do with it? You throw it. You throw it in a trash pile, right? You throw it in the corner. You take it to the toilet, you use it like toilet paper, and you throw it in the privy, right? And that pile especially, but all of these piles, they don't get messed with anymore. Of course, you don't go dig through these things. At best, right, if it's a trash pile, what did they do? They would, when it started to get a little too heapy, they go outside, stamp it flat, and start tossing more stuff on top. That preserves things really, really well. So we end up with documents that look like this, amazingly legible documents, even though they are over 2,000 years old, written on wood. Now, if we're thinking about political thought in early China, let's change gears and think about that for a second. The emperor is usually at the center of everything. Okay? And if we look at contemporary depictions of the emperor, what the emperor was like, we see a particular picture. Jia Yi happens to be, not coincidentally, subject of my dissertation, right? So this is familiar stuff to me. But he was also the first political thinker to live his entire life under the imperial system, or the first important one, the first one that we have a lot of stuff from. And what he said about the emperor is that in the proper ancient sense, after to east and west, north and south, wherever boat or cart can attain, wherever human tracks reach, none does not submit. Then the ruler is called the Son of Heaven. This is a definition of empire as he understood it in his time, right? It is the emperor ruling everything more or less directly. Elsewhere he says, if but some are not the Son of Heaven's subjects, how can he still be Son of Heaven, right? It's got to be universal. This is the other thing about the emperor. If we look to another source, a slightly later source, this is also a 2nd century BC source called the Huainanzi. It's a collection, so it was put together out of materials that already existed. We get a slightly different picture of the position of the emperor. Here, the position of the Lord of People is like the brilliance of the sun and moon. He is to whom the realm together turns its eyes and looks, inclines its ears and listens, to whom it gazes with neck outstretched, standing tiptoe. Now, the emperor is still at the center here. But if you notice, there's actually a slight shift in the decades between Jia Yi and the Huainanzi. Because the emperor is there, but all of a sudden he's not really doing anything anymore. He's been somehow subtracted from this direct rule. Jia Yi saw everything as direct, right? the emperor, situation within the seas, which is to say within the territory of the emperor, should be like that of the body, ordering an arm, ordering a finger. None should fail to obey the command. That's Jiayi. And yet, Huainanzi, a few decades later, the ruler of men sees with the eyes of the realm, hears with the ears of the realm, considers by means of the knowledge of the realm, contends by means of the force of the realm. So the emperor is making use of the realm in all of these very different ways. But the way that his rule reaches people at the lower level has shifted. And all of a sudden we're talking about a system of bureaucracy, right, that makes his will extend below and gives him knowledge about what's going on in all those different areas. We can see this also presented in other ways in contemporary sources. Michael Nyland, who we just heard about, the most prolific scholar of early China, and definitely among the most creative scholars of early China, I think, has written recently about the value of tables, right? And sort of, we look at a table, we're like, oh yeah, could you be less interesting, please? Like, no, you can't, or so you think, right? But as Michael Nyland points out, actually, these historical tables, which were created in Han times, contain a lot of historical information. They're actually a very sophisticated way of conceiving of the past. And in this particular example, we see you'll have to imagine there's a dot here on this first column, right? It says 高地元年. Oh, thank you. Is it? Okay.
Little green dot.
The green one. No wonder I missed it. Mine's red. Okay, so the first emperor of the Han Dynasty, he's up there. And we notice all these lines below him, and what this table does is put out the years of his reign and put out these various bureaucratic positions and things that are happening, okay? This is complicated enough that it would deserve a talk of its own. For now, we just have to notice that what's going on with the emperor? Nothing. Nada. Like he's there. And then it's a year, right? We get this picture that all of a sudden the emperor is just sort of standing there. Now scholars have sort of overlooked this, right? We have entire books devoted to writing apologia for the power of the Chinese state throughout history, down to the present. I would venture that some of these people are making excuses for things, but that's a separate question. But what everyone seems to agree on is that the emperor has all this power, right? He's at the center. And most scholars have sort of looked past the fact that there is all of a sudden this big division between the emperor and the actual functioning, right? People who come with that mindset might look to strips like this one and be like, aha, see, I told you. And what are they telling me? They're saying this: the emperor decrees, saying accepted. According to conventional understandings, every single document, every single law, every single change to the system in early China, in Imperial China, had to be approved personally by the emperor, and the approval looked like this. Exactly like this. In every single case, it said exactly the same thing. The emperor decrees, saying accepted. My suggestion is that when we begin to look at what's going on in Jianshui Jingguan, and we could pay some attention to other thinkers too, but when we look at what's going on in this specific site, our understanding of this changes a lot. And it no longer looks like the emperor's direct personal approval. It rather begins to look like something else. Now, sometimes these look a little bit more complicated, right? Sometimes it could be the emperor says accepted, and then we have a note about which emperor it is that we're talking about, right? This happens to be from 200 BC. Another example, but we notice it's the same exact words again. Here we have another example, blah, 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 blah. Because these are archaeologically recovered, of course, they've been damaged by the passage of time. This is a fragment. We don't have the preceding text. Something's a constant, and the emperor decrees saying accepted. And again, this is dated to a particular year. This is sent down, we know, therefore, after the fact, because if it were sent at the time, it would be part of a dated document. You wouldn't need to add this explanatory note that it comes from 44 BCE. Sometimes we even see other sorts of things that are a bit more, or actually, sorry, this is another example of the same sort of thing, right? a more complicated command, which is being re-sent out, right? And here we have the note in the middle that I've bolded. The emperor decrees saying accepted. We've seen this already several times. You're already feeling bored. That's part of my point. We'll come back to that. And then again noted that which emperor it is that we're talking about. We're talking about Emperor Wen in a particular year. Sometimes we see imperial names, right? The imperial title, the imperial formula on things that we wouldn't expect the emperor to actually be at all interested in, like this one. Here is supposedly a document with an emperor's seal, which is to say he was supposed to have been involved with it personally, sent out to someone who was at Juyan, which is to say in the area of Jianshui Jingguan in modern-day Gansu. The emperor decrees saying, riding the relay system, hasten to bring this to the place of Juyan Zhangye, where one in charge of subjugating the enemy, Malarian Guang, is. Do not delay this, and it goes on from there. So from this, if we were to accept our usual sort of understanding about imperial documents, we have to believe that the emperor is not only signing these things off, but say, here's how you should send it, right? Like the emperor is taking a stamp and putting it on there and sending it off that way. Highly unlikely, right? This, we already begin to see the emperor is there and yet not. I would suggest something like maybe a bit of an institutional voice. Oops, I meant to bold that previously. Sorry about that. Here we have something else, right? Another casual mention of the emperor, right? He's just pointed out. Emperor Wen sent this out. We just mentioned him. He's present, not saying anything. Here we have another case. Emperor Wu's nephews getting money for being. I think that's a familiar situation even today, but the emperor's just there. He's not saying anything. He's far from tabooed. And supposedly powerful, and yet silent. Okay. Now we see these things, and there are lots and lots of examples of the emperor saying accepted, right, where that is. And I want to suggest to you that we're seeing a phenomenon that actually doesn't fit with the traditional conception that emerged from that single corpus idea of history, right, that everything was there and solid and a single piece passed through the generations. People have noticed that the emperor is sometimes silenced in the corpus in the way that I just pointed, or in the way that I just pointed out from Jia Yi and Huainan. People like Xu Lianda and Zhu Ziyan, right, who wrote a book about the imperial system. And their point is, well, the emperor sometimes didn't want to get involved because he was so far above everybody else, right? He just wanted to have the ultimate power about decision, and all the details are left to other people. But the emperor is still powerful. He's silent, but he's still powerful. Mark Edward Lewis, I would say my favorite scholar currently writing about early China in North America. He noticed this also. He put it down to legalist philosophy. That's not a joke, it's true. No? You can ask questions later. Oh, whoops. Yeah. Okay. I hope you hear this, Mark. What he said is that this is an expression of legalist thought, right? Legalist thought being, if you know anything about early Chinese thought, is the thought made famous, I think Han Fei's, right, as the most famous example. You set up this system and you don't need to do anything. You can go back and relax because you set up the proper system. You don't need to get involved. That's how Lewis interprets this. And a final person, Roger Ames, coming at it from a philosophical point of view, also noticed this phenomenon, and he said it's an example of Taoist philosophy, right? The Taoist philosophy of non-action, very famous, right? Don't do anything and everything just happens because you're a sage ruler. Yeah, all of these make a certain amount of sense, okay? In terms of merely describing what's in the text, they make great sense. They're all coming at it from a particular perspective, however, and that's a perspective of motivation. They're imagining, why would a ruler do this? Why would a ruler have a situation in which all he does is say, accepted? I want to look rather at the effects and see how these things get, and think about how it looks out in the hinterlands, far, far away. To do this, I'm going to make a couple of big jumps. And I'm going to jump all the way to Umberto Eco. That's a big jump. And I will be happy to talk at great length about how I ended up at Umberto Eco, which actually is connected to another research project I have going. Doesn't really directly connect to what I'm doing here today. Except that when I was reading one of his books, I noticed this interesting definition that he offered about information. And what Umberto Eco said about information is that information only exists and exists to the degree that something is unknown by the person who is receiving a particular message. Okay? So if you already know something and you're told again, that's information free. If you know something is coming every single time, in this definition, that is information free. Umberto Eco was actually drawing on some very early information theory, like people writing in the 50s and 60s, who somehow what they wrote ended up giving us artificial intelligence today. I don't know how that worked. But I think the observation is an interesting one. But he also added a sort of a wrinkle to this that the information theory guys didn't. Because as a humanist, he realizes that actually these messages, which seem to have no information, are still important. And he posited the presence of meaning. Right? That's very possible for something to be completely free of information and still mean a lot. Right? I think this is easily understandable to all of us. Right? A happy birthday card. It's my birthday. I already know it's my birthday. You're someone, I assume you're my mother. Right? I assume you care about me, and yet you wish me happy birthday. There's no information in that message, and yet it still means something, right, when we do these things. So something could have meaning and no information. And then he makes another point in a slightly different context in the same book, where he talks about density of information versus clarity. And he points out that the more information that's in a particular message, the harder it is to communicate that message. Okay? If I've got a whole lot of new stuff to tell you, right, that is very intrinsically very unclear and hard to communicate. If there's very little information, or let us say no information at all of a sudden I have this message which is extremely easy to communicate because it's so dang clear, and maybe it's been distilled down to nothing but meaning. Right? Maybe only meaning is left. All right, oops, sorry about that. That says Jaworski in silence. When nothing is left, when there's no information communicated, I want to suggest that we are talking about a situation in which the message is actually one of silence. Right? Maybe you know something's being communicated. And silence, in the way I'm using it, is drawing on Adam Jaworski, who wrote this book about silence. And it's a surprisingly long book, given the topic. But he makes a lot of interesting points about silence. That silence isn't a yes or no, right? It's a degree. And that sometimes you can have more or less silence, right? And maybe something is, almost silent, right? And still highly functional. He also makes the point that when people are communicating, sometimes silence is a mode of communication. And when silence is the mode of communication, that actually makes a lot of demands on the recipient, right? If you are receiving a message that's one of silence, you have to understand a lot and you have to think a lot yourself before you can understand that properly. In the case of an imperial system, I'll begin to hint over towards my point that I'm getting to. If you're in an imperial system, you already know a lot. Right? You have to know that. You have to put your mind into work. You have to think. You have to be accepting things already. So let's look at one of these, right? Because what I want to propose to you is that if we're talking about these definitions, if we're talking about Umberto Eco, if we're talking about Adam Jaworski, right? We're talking about a situation in which these documents like this one here that just merely says "ka" actually say nothing. Because if it's required that it has to be at the end of every single document, by the time you get there, right, you already know it's there. If this document comes to us through a bureaucratic system, and we know that at some level the emperor is supposed to have said yes, and every single time it's exactly the same, by the time that gets to us, it has no information anymore. This strip has no information, right? It is a silent strip in more senses than one. And yet it's one in which there's a lot of meaning, right? Because it tells us about the imperial system by implication, and it draws us in, right? All of a sudden we're thinking about, we have to accept this, we have to give ourselves over to it. And thinking again about Umberto Eco's ideas, it's an extremely clear message, right? Not a lot of content, not a lot of information, maybe no information whatsoever, just meaning, but extremely and strong message about something. And I would suggest maybe it's not even about the emperor anymore at this point in time. When you get to this far down, you're not even talking about a person, you're merely talking about a system, or rather, you're hearing about a system. You are being communicated to about a system. Now, if you were thoroughly familiar with the strips from the northwest part of China, you would be raising your hand right now and saying, but. So I will save you the energy. I will point out to you some apparent exceptions to what I'm talking about. Because sometimes it seems like we do have the emperor saying something, right? Other than this, this thing that I've said is meaningless and devoid of content. We have this example here. I'll just read it because I've got time. Statutes and ordinances shall discuss reducing capital punishment to those punishments that can be eliminated or reduced, making them clear and easy to understand, and memorialize them individually. This is a command. Do this. Go out and look into the punishments. The emperor is supposedly telling people. Does not the documents, which is to say the Book of Documents, one of the high classical documents of early China, say, oh, the worry of punishments. This is admonishing us. Think about the punishments. Delve deep. Study them. Pity them, the people on the receiving end. Strive to manage the ancient laws. I will examine the result with my whole heart. Now this comes to us from the Northwest, but actually we know that it's an imperial document because we have a parallel document in the received corpus. So we see the overlap that we like, and of course that really gets the juices flowing because we have confirmation of something. And it looks like the emperor is saying a lot right here, right? Making this command, saying, I care about all of you. I want to propose to you that actually the emperor is not saying very much at all. Why? Because what is the emperor doing? Supposedly, the emperor is commanding some people to go in to look at something, right? Do a little bit of investigation. And then those of us who are familiar with bureaucratic systems, such as those that run most universities, yes, let's go and talk about that some more. Let's look into that. It's exactly the opposite of a command for action, right? It's a command for non-action, but still it's a proposal that the emperor cares, right? And he's like, I'm going to look into this. I really am. Next week. I propose to you that this is another sort of contentless message, right? By the time you got this, if you were part of this system and you could understand this message, there's nothing surprising, nothing unexpected, nothing new in there at all. There's no information whatsoever. We have another case of a wordier message that says the same thing. Nothing. Just meaning. This emperor rules. Now finally, I will, before I finish, accept that there is, in fact, one exception that I found. It says, August heaven and the high thearch bestowed great blessing, completing the mandate and ordering the sequence with tallies and tokens in bronze caskets and on documents, blah, blah, blah. Now this language is quite peculiar, right? Because it is pieced together out of ancient documents. But this is actually a piece of an extremely important document. Okay? Because this document was promulgated, and we know this from its connections to the received corpus, as well as from the historical context, promulgated by Longmang, which is to say the usurper who overthrew the Han Dynasty and proclaimed himself ruler. And this is part of the message by which he proclaimed himself ruler. So all of a sudden we have this message which is, despite being put together out of pieces from other texts, right, is completely unexpected in this system, is full of information, despite the sort of stale and obscure language that it uses. It has a lot of meaning too, right? They can have both. So what I hope I've persuaded you of is that we have the situation in early China where the bureaucratic system just sort of exists. I am working on bureaucracy, I've been thinking about it for a while. I would suggest that bureaucracies are, generally speaking, what they call emergent systems, which is to say they are more than their holes, and actually you can remove any one of those holes. And I would propose that, unlike those historians and scholars who suggest that the emperor is at the center of everything and he's the key to everything, that actually you can take the emperor out of this system. He doesn't really matter anymore. And I would even suggest that there are instances in Chinese history, in Han Dynasty history, where we can see this exact thing happening, where the emperor becomes completely removed from the system. He is, at any rate, in these documents from the Northwest, silent, right? Even if we accept that he's important, he's not saying anything. He's communicating zero information But we do have some meaning brought by the system itself. Thanks.
Questions. All right. Harry's got his hand up first. All right, PC.
Who isn't tired? So thank you for a really stimulating talk. I'm working on a project that is kind of similar to the Qing Dynasty, and my kind of gut reaction, and you may have encountered this before, is that, I mean, in the Qing Dynasty, when we talk about imperial authority, it's channeled in two different ways. So one is through the routine system, which, you know, if you're getting a Shinkai Tiban or like a routine memorial, that's, you know, whatever is imperial there is like the Ke that you're talking about. But then you have the secret memorial system where you actually have an imperial voice in conversation with a select group of people who are allowed to communicate with the emperor. So my question to you is, as you're piecing these things together, I mean, could there be a case made that this, what you're talking about here in Zhenshui is routine system and in the Han Dynasty, and that there is a other system where the emperor's authority is more personal and more articulated?
Yes, you could argue exactly that, and that would be my point, right? That when we look at things from a different perspective, from a different place, and when we divide things up, and we no longer assume that history is one big continuous whole, but rather accept that it exists in blips, blurbs, and chunks, that we get a very different perspective when we think about the border region. Some people have suggested that the border region is completely separate from the imperial center in the Han Dynasty. I don't think that's right. I would disagree with that. But I would say they're clearly connected, right? We know from the dates on these documents that there is flow back and forth. But I would say it is completely shut off from any sort of contact with the emperor at the center. There are cases in which emperors in the Han period, I'm sure you know, did have, you know, lots of communication with those around them. There are cases in which they had no contact or no communication, no effective communication with those around them either, and yet this system is still functioning. So I totally see what you're saying. And I would also say, though, the other thing is that the assumptions of scholars who are working in the sort of traditional mode of reasoning, which assumes a single corpus and a complete whole, they're educated originally under that sort of system, and that is that you're talking about, the Qing Dynasty system of an extremely powerful emperor with that knowledge about what's happening in the center, and that has colored how people read Han Dynasty documents. And I would say actually we kind of need to unlearn that and look at what we can see in the Qin and Han period.
I think David has a question.
So there's something about one slide, the first of your exception slides, that might be worth you're just talking about. I expect it won't affect your argument, but the appearance of the imperial first-person pronoun zhen. That seems to be the only time that it showed up in the material that you showed.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. I hadn't thought about that. It's
so for people who don't know, there was a pronoun supposed to be only used by the emperor that shows up in one of the slides.
Yeah, and that is probably part of it being a wordy exception rather than it's part of this. That's a good point. I would say we do see that in some other instances too, and back to the Qin Dynasty period. So it is part of the language. But
when translating, did you think about not just translating as I, but like imperial we or something like that?
I did not think about that actually. But do you like to say you would rather render it we?
No, I'm wondering if you thought about it, and if there's any need to identify this is an unusual pronoun.
That's an interesting thought. You mean like an asterisk or something? Yeah, I guess I don't know how I would do that, but I will give it some thought. Thank you. Yeah.
We don't get to use that pronoun ourselves.
Talk for yourself. Speak for yourself. Who's next? We have exactly, 20 minutes before we have to vacate? Yes, young man?
Hello, thanks for the wonderful lecture. It was very interesting to hear. And one question I have is something that's just a bit hazy to me is, could you go more into the definition of just information as you're using it, in this talk?
Yes. So, I mean, information can be anything, right? As the information theorists talked about it back in the 50s and 60s. What they're doing with it nowadays, I have no idea. I've only read those earlier sources. It can be almost anything. So there are some people who did early sort of aesthetic analyses in which they treated, aesthetic things like music as information, and saying the degree to which it's unexpected means it has more information or less. In practical terms, I'm just talking about what would be contained in a document. Okay, and so if we look at a multi-strip document, this is just a picture of a rabbit, but because I thought it was cute, if we went all the way back to the start and had a multi-strip document, we would see that actually there are pieces, writing across all of them, and they have lots and lots of things that are said on there, changes to the legal system. Something like that would be something that is unknown and unexpected, or at least unexpectable in its detail to the recipient, and that is what I would then call an information-dense piece of the document. And the emperor's piece on the end then is the one with no information. Does that make sense? So it is this it is the unknowable, the new, unexpectable piece that makes information as such, and something that doesn't need to be there or is already known, doesn't have any information, and then you have sort of gradations between them, which is a place where music can be helpful. Like you could think about some sort of music that you hear. If you interpret that as a message, the degree to which it's unfamiliar is exactly the degree to which it's actually information in their analysis.
Gotcha.
Question here.
New things keep coming out from the archaeologists. They keep unearthing new slips.
I know.
And like last summer, this summer, they uncovered like 4,500 Han slips, and including about 500 slips from the Chu state. And I was wondering, you probably follow these very closely. So what, in your opinion, have been the most exciting discoveries in the past couple of years?
Well, as someone who studies bureaucracy, I may define exciting different from other people, but I really like and I find it interesting, the strips from Liye. If you know, this is Liye's in southern part of China, and there's a couple of 3rd century wells, and it's not the only case where we see this. We see this in other places in early China too. When another way you could dispose of some strips that you were done with was to throw them in the well. I guess I don't really understand the logic there, being that you get your water from the well, presumably too, but that's what you did. And a couple of these wells have been excavated. And it seems that what happened in the case of Liye is that there was some sort of an archive or a set of documents that had been stored in a government office of some sort, and they just grabbed them and threw them into the well. So that as archaeologists have dug up these set of documents, we have this picture of this place that we simply don't have from anywhere else. And because of its sort of completeness, we have indications of all sorts of practices we didn't really know existed, or that if we knew they existed, we didn't understand at all what they would look like. Things like government involvement in local religion in the Qin period. We now see that government was very closely involved in local religion in the Qin period, whereas in the transmitted corpus, there's no indication of this at all, as well as lots of details about the bureaucracy and its function.
David, you want to follow up?
I always have questions about your corpus.
Yes.
So perhaps it could be just called discovered text, right?
I would rather say excavated myself, but
Well,
sure.
whatever, right?
Yeah.
You seem to be indicating maybe it was the bamboo strips, but it includes a larger batch of things, discovered text, which is important all along, Juzijinan and stuff like that, and then also faux discovered text as well, like the old text of the Book of Documents. But I was curious about, you have these strips are only used on one side, right?
Yes.
So why aren't they used on the other side? You might say because it has the emperor's words on it, but then if you're throwing them out, that's not respectful either. Both sides were used in the cache at Dunhuang, for instance. And so what are your thoughts about that? Why didn't they recycle them? You can also scrape them besides using the other side.
So there are a few different pieces here. So if you're talking about when you say Dunhuang, which Dunhuang cache are you referring to? Are you talking about Mogaoku, or are you talking about Han Dynasty strips from Dunhuang area?
The biggest one discovered at the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah, so, well, they're both discovered at the same time. So are we talking about Mogaoku? Because that's the case where we have silk and paper and that sort of thing that are written on both sides. Yeah, but on the Han Dynasty wooden strips from Dunhuang, they're not written on both sides. Because that is an interesting question. We do see definitely strips that are reused. We do have the indications that the scribes were using their little knives to scrape off, and sometimes we even have those transcribed, the pieces that were on there. So they definitely did reuse them, but they were generally only written on one side, and I don't have a reason why. They were sometimes labeled on the backside, or there would be, so there could be a number on the backside, or there could be like a diagonal, like a quick slash across to indicate the sequence in case the binding got broken and you needed to resequence them. But I had never thought about that question, like why only write on one side? Yeah, I don't know.
Jeremy has a question.
So I have a question about why you needed the excavated text to make this claim, because a very common, I think already popular view about Han Dynasty is that the emperor sometimes is not so much that he's silent, but he's silenced by, say, consort family or powerful ministers, Wang Mang, which you raised being one of those. So, and that the emperor sometimes becomes a rubber stamp. So 制约可 being a rubber stamp for anything the consort family or the minister wants to happen. So it's not as if people were.
So who are you
really
thinking about? Which emperor are you referring to? Because actually, I would challenge that. I'm not sure that I see that happening frequently in accounts of the Han Dynasty, and Wang Mang as a historical phenomenon is a very different sort of situation. So we could look at a case like that of the Chang'e Wang, which would be the strongest case of what you're talking about, in which an emperor is put into power by by underlings and then removed from power. But that's a separate sort of issue, because what emerges from the excavated text is the picture that, the emperor is present, is giving meaning throughout the realm without having to say anything. So, I mean, without some more specificity on your part, I'm not sure I could respond more effectively. Who are you thinking about?
I'm thinking Wang Mang would be the most clear example, but people like Dou Taihou or Lü Taihou and Huo Guang. So in those
Huo Guang
cases,
is the case of the Chang'e Wang. So this is he's a very exceptional case. I would say that the Chang'e Wang is not silenced; he's removed from power. Right? He is the one person who managed to be emperor and not be emperor anymore and not die in the process in all of Chinese history, I think. But until we get to the end, but I would say he was less silenced. The other cases are a little more interesting, and the Taihou is probably the best example of what you're talking about. But in the case of this, I would propose is at a slightly different period in the Han Dynasty, and that what happened there and what happened in this period. Now the expansion into the northwest region started a little earlier, but it's primarily a product of Emperor Wu's time. Right, and this extremely strong centralization. So if we're coming at it from the perspective of Han Dynasty historiography, it's exactly the point in which you would expect there to be the least silence, because Emperor Wu is the emperor, this most powerful. He's basically the sign of a potent emperor. But again, the idea of him being silent is, I would suggest, unexpected, at least. And those who come after him, who inherited that strong system, that's also unexpected. The fact that Wang Mang could manipulate the system and take power for himself is obviously a bit more complicated, but
So if I could add, it seems weird that it's precisely with Wang Mang that you say the emperor seemed to have a voice.
Yes.
And I think I could explain it, because Wang Mang feels that he needs people to think that the emperor is loud and
I agree completely. Yeah, I didn't mean to say it's unexpected. I mean it is unexpected within the system, but there is definitely a reason for it. And the reason that Wang Mang had to make a big noise is because he was doing something that was unexpected, namely usurping the emperor.
Okay, thank you.
I see this gentleman over here. Would you pass the mic?
Might we look at it overall as an administrative tactic to provide a disjuncture between out there and at the center, in which the image of the emperor is not as so much a human being as a mystic figure, or in which he is just that, and the bureaucracy then, the administration, is standing between him and the outer world, so these documents are an administrative tactic?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think we could see that in terms of, if we're thinking about it, again, I touched on this issue of motivation versus effect, of cause versus effect. And from a cause, one might imagine it that way, right? And that would be in line with some of what Mark Lewis and to a lesser degree, Xu Lianda and Zhu Ziyan wrote. I would just say in terms of the effect out in the system, right, what emerges is different than what its reason might be, and that's worth commenting on too. So.
Just one comment. I've as a media consultant here at U of M, you can see we just did a little changing of the guard here. But I've seen a lot of presentations here, and rarely has my curiosity been so piqued.
Well, thank you. That's nice of you to say.
By a presentation. And so I just wanted to thank you and to say that I am very curious about the rest of your scholarship. And I want to go back and watch the video that we're making, which I understand is going to be posted online. And so I encourage everyone to do that. The points that you made about communication, I'll be thinking about them for a long time. So
thank you.
I thank you.
I just have a question of clarification, which is also a follow-up on Jeremy's question. Could you say a bit more about how the excavated text you are using shifts our understanding of Han discourse about the emperor? So the mainstream discourse that you are reacting against depicts emperor as a policymaker, or he's depicted as more active. How? So if you could explain that shift a bit more.
So so you mean in terms of Han Dynasty historiography, or you mean conceptually more broadly?
You were talking about our understanding of the corpus, the canon, and what the canon says, and now we have these excavated texts that do not fit into that, and not only they are outside of these borders that we drew, they also say, I understood you to also say that they also now change the way we understand the content of the corpus?
I do suggest that. Okay, so a couple of different things. So the kind of document that we have here is almost unrepresented in received text. So just the whole genre of things that we're looking at is almost unknown before excavated text came. So this is already, I would say, a big shift. In the course of historiography of the Han Dynasty and of later dynasties, we have a lot of scholars writing, beginning not later than the 1st century CE, writing sort of very self-consciously about bureaucracy and the way that the bureaucracy functions as a thing, and they always seem to put the emperor at the center as the key player. Now, there are these cases where there may be some exceptions, but the fact that there are exceptions and commented on as exceptions already tells us that the system is what it is. And what I'm saying is that actually the system isn't what that was. Now, when people, and I'm thinking here of, the slightly more traditional and conservative historians writing in the 20th century looked back, they grew out of this idea of thinking about things as a big single whole, and so they plugged documents into them, and you can plug those documents in there, so you could deny sort of the separateness that I'm proposing, but I think that would be a mistake. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
I think we should let them be separate and be different.
So you only had a question.
Sure.
Thank you for your presentation, Bert. And when you showed us the emperor's response, like when the emperor was talking, I could see the emperor was kind of making explicit quotation or making a connection to the existing text and classics. So how would you see the effect of making such quotation have, like, in comparison to remaining silence?
So are you thinking about, you're thinking about the one that is in fact from the emperor, the strip that I showed, or are you thinking about the Wang Mang strip where he's drawing almost all of his language? Because I would suggest that they're quite different in their function. Wang Mang's much easier to explain than the Imperial case. I mean, in that case, we're talking about a situation in which there have been a set of texts designated as being authoritative and then promulgated as authoritative texts that in some case didn't even exist before. the one I showed was from the Shangshu. Actually, we can look at examples of quotations from the Lunyu or something like this, a text that probably simply didn't exist much before it was quoted here. And so we have this I would suggest, a sort of use of classical words and classical language to, buy into and to use this cultural potency to strengthen the system. The Wangmang case is different because Wangmang was doing something very unusual and unexpected, and he had to convince people of it and get people's attention.
And for the case of the emperor, like, would that be more powerful than remaining silent for the emperor?
Oh well, I would say if we go back to the text that I was looking at, like my proposition, is this the one you're talking about? Yeah. So my proposition is that the emperor actually here doesn't really say anything, right? Because there's no information as I define it. So the fact that there's someone, whoever his ghostwriter was, happened to put in a piece from the Shangshu is connecting it to this sort of cultural system, I would suggest, but not actually increasing its information. The message has almost no information, but still has a lot of meaning.
Thank you.
Just curious about the translation of 知曰可.
Yes.
And so I'm from outer space with regard to this stuff. And so I tend to think of 知 as a noun. To take it as an adverb in a during fashion said, okay. And so that's one part. The other part is that later on we know that emperors always had a staff of people who drafted everything for them. Some of them liked to show they could write a lot. Emperor Wu, of course, wrote a poem supposedly and so forth like that. But would anybody really think that the emperor would have drafted everything to begin with?
Well, so those are two different questions that are tied together by the word 知. I mean, because the word 知 is supposedly, if we believe Cai Yong anyway, right, exclusive preserve of the emperor, or at least maybe not exclusive, but the preserve of the emperor, right, the way that you create a decree.
Right, but edict is a noun too. You can dictify, I guess.
So that. Yeah, so the decree, I would just read it as a noun following sort of Cai Yong et al. But I don't think, of course, in classical Chinese being what it is, it's hard to say that something is not something else, if you could make a good argument for reading it that way. But I still think in terms of sense, it would not be radically altered.
You can force anything into another part of speech.
Yes.
Usually, but then you are forcing it.
Yes. So in terms of sense, I don't think I would read it. I don't think it could be read very differently, and it wouldn't have. And it is so formulaic that I don't think it could have another sense. I don't know if that.
Your construction makes it coming more directly from the emperor.
Yes. Well, that word does mark.
Sort of as a document that's mediated already.
Yes, and the usual way of understanding that is that was what the emperor said. Like, that's supposed to be the emperor's decree. That's what the Han Dynasty sources tell us. That's how a decree was marked. And so most readers, and in this respect, rendering aside, I don't think I'm out of line with the majority of readers to take it as an expression of the emperor. It's just my interpretation of the significance of that is different from most people.
Any other questions? I'd like to thank Professor Sanft for
Thanks.
his excellent talk.